Welcome to our panel on creating investment approach to thriving instead of surviving. It's very apropos given the comments from the administrator just before. Thank you to the Chamber Foundation and all of you for including the U.S. Chamber and our expert panel in this important discussion. The Chamber has long supported building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure as part of its approach to improve the way in which our country addresses our infrastructure challenges. Companies and communities are looking to reduce the risks and prepare ahead of the next disaster. And pre-disaster mitigation, which is what the administrator was alluding to, is at the heart of those issues. We have a very impressive panel of speakers and not a lot of time to get through that panel. And given our focus on the Olympics this week, I think it's very appropriate that we're going to be sprinting through this panel discussion. So what I'll do is I'll introduce our panel in full, and then I'll go back and I'll ask you one at a time some questions to respond to. And then if we have some time left, we'll have some discussion, and then if we can, have some questions and answers. So we have 4 panelists. We have Alejandro Contreras. He's Director of Preparedness, Communication Coordination at the Office of Disaster Assistance of the Small Business Administration. We have Kevin Bush. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs, Office of Community Planning at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Camille Crane. She's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC Program Section Chief at FEMA. And then we have Luke Apicella. He's the Vice President of Impact Investments at Prudential. And Luke, I'd like to start with you and talk a little bit about why building resilience and making investments in issues around pre-disaster mitigation is important for the insurance sector and the private sector in general, and what that means to your insurance portfolio and your overall approach to investments.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Really happy to be here. So I'll take that question by thinking of kind of the 2 elements of an insurance company. They have the insurance product, and then they have the investment portfolio, which is once they use that policyholder's premium. And so, I mean, on the product side, insurance is the idea that any policyholder can protect his or her idiosyncratic risk by pooling together with a diversified group of people similar to them. And I may be biased here, but that's a great value proposition for policyholders. And, you know, sort of definitionally, insurance is offering people resiliency. It's offering protection. Now, for an insurance company to offer this, they need to orchestrate that those potential claims all won't come due at the same time. And we have an amazing group of actuaries that know how to do that. But insurance providers also really have to offer this trust and longevity to make sure that they are going to be there for their policyholders. So Prudential prides itself on having 140 years of meeting promises. And then on the investment side, you know, similarly, there's that optimization of diversification, but perhaps more interestingly, asset allocation allows for some influence over future conditions. Or said differently, you can actually evaluate not only the investment risks and performance, but where you place capital, in which projects, in which companies is gonna shape the economy. And Prudential's had an impact investments group since 1976. That's where I work, and you know, now we are managing $1 billion of the insurance company. And probably one of the most visible examples of this, of creating a thriving, not just surviving area is all the investments that we've done since being founded in Newark, New Jersey. We've done everything from kind of revitalizing the downtown to going all the way through the wards, investing in the arts and housing. And I'll leave it there because I know we're on this sprint.
Well, thanks so much, Luke. So I'd like to turn to you now, Camille. So what's the role of the private sector in implementing the BRIC program, and where do you see partnering with your USG colleagues here on the panel as you move forward towards the next opportunity for investments?
So thank you, Chuck, and thank you for the invite. It's really great to follow the FEMA administrator where she mentioned our program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. So that is a grant program, the newest one for FEMA, that offers mitigation to applicants and sub-applicants that are states, locals, tribes, and territories. As she said, we just made a $500 million selection, and we're about to go into our FY21 program, which will be $1 billion, so doubling that investment again. When we were setting up BRIC, we developed guiding principles, and one of those is to promote partnerships, where I think the private sector plays a really vital role. There's a couple of reasons we put that in the program. First is we know that the mitigation needs, the resiliency needs, especially around infrastructure, are larger than any one grant program. So we really want to say through BRIC, how can we start conversations to catalyze actions that everyone can take together. Secondly, we know that as we look at mitigating a lot of those critical facilities and critical infrastructure in communities, those aren't always owned by the public. That is, are actually applicants and sub-applicants. It's owned by the private sector. So we want to make sure that partnership is key, because we definitely need those services to stay on during a disaster, because we know that helps the community recover so much faster. So as I said, the folks that can apply to our program are the states, locals, tribes, and territories, but we absolutely can do projects that are owned by private sector, as well as other private citizens. So we just need to have that partnership. Other ways the private sector can absolutely play is when you look at the technical expertise that potentially private sector has to help communities put together grant applications and implement projects. Or all of our projects have to be cost shared. So there's a non-financial cost share of anywhere from 10 to 25%, typically 25, that potentially private sector can help fund to get these projects into those communities. We also want to reward communities that private sector, as well as other non-governmental entities. So in our competition criteria, we include leveraging partners. We really want, you heard the administrator talk about system-wide approaches to really looking across systems to making sure they're resilient. So we want to make sure there's a whole community approach in these projects that we're able to fund. And then finally, I'll say, we understood when we built the program, our stakeholders felt that partnerships are important, but for a lot of our state, locals, and tribes and territories, they had questions about that. How do I get a partner? How does that work? Where do I go? And so we've actually even added a project type where we can fund partnership work. And so this is something for communities to really help them get some seed money to figure out how to partner with other sectors, including the private sector.
Thanks so much, Camille. I'll turn to you now, Kevin. So I know that HUD has long invested in disaster response, but looking at the opportunities for pre-disaster mitigation, where is HUD investing, and what are opportunities best suited for private sector involvement in your program portfolio?
Great question. So as you pointed out, HUD invests billions of dollars every year in housing, infrastructure, and services in neighborhoods and cities across the US, and with an ever increasing role in aiding communities responding to and recovering from the most devastating disaster. For example, that includes over $67 billion currently under management through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This has strong rebuilding standards baked in, but we also have 16.2 of that specifically allocated for building resilience to future disasters through the CDBG MID program. These funds have driven innovation and helped elevate the national conversation on resilient recovery through things like Rebuild by Design and the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And all of this work is done in partnership with the private sector. For example, homes reconstructed in Puerto Rico are being rebuilt to the National Green Building Standard using resilient materials and design along green building elements like on-site solar and natural air ventilation. And on the multifamily side, which involves even more involvement from the private sector, we have grantees like Virgin Islands Housing Authority breaking ground on a 60-unit affordable multifamily housing that has low-income housing tax credits and CDBG DR to develop an entirely off-grid generating solar energy on site, recycling gray water built to withstand hurricanes, multifamily affordable housing on St. Thomas. And we're also setting an example with innovative, resilient, and catalytic infrastructure investments like the Ohio Creek Watershed Project in Norfolk, Virginia, where we've got a $112 million grant being used to take a hybrid green and gray infrastructure approach to reduce flooding. These investments in infrastructure, as I'm sure this group knows, are so important to economic development and really undergirding the ability to pull in the private sector in so many of these places. It's not just disaster recovery that we're involved in too. We have funding that goes out to 2,100 states and local governments every year for a wide range of community development activities. Some communities can actually use a program called the Section 108 Economic Development Program, which allows grantees to leverage their future block grants to do specifically economic development activities. And that's being used even by small towns at the nexus of resilience and economic development. For example, Mount Vernon, Washington, 35,000 people population, took a $12.9 million Section 108 economic development loan that enabled the revitalization of a nearby commercial area that had been stalled due to flood risk. That loan was used to create a flood wall that protected the downtown, put in a public waterfront park, and really drive economic development to that area. So there's no shortage of work for the private sector to come in alongside our very flexible community development funds.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. So Alejandro, I'll turn to you now. We know that many small businesses don't have contingency plans in place to prepare ahead of the next crisis. What investments do small businesses need to make, and how is SBA helping?
Great, excellent question. So we're out there promoting to small businesses the need to have a disaster preparedness plan. Typically, we present it to them as part of 6 elements. One, establish a communications plan. 2, protect your documents, which is very easy to do. Make sure that they're, like you can utilize technology, the cloud, just make sure that they're accessible to you. Reviewing your insurance coverage, and not just once, but keeping up with that. Many small businesses will grow over time and might fail to adequately update their insurance coverage as that growth is happening. Create a solid supply chain for the business. COVID was a perfect example of how many businesses were affected by the supply chain and not necessarily by the direct impacts from the virus, meaning they didn't have staff or people who might have, been affected. Planning for an alternative location. Another thing that is probably many small businesses need to look at now in a post-COVID era. We saw many businesses that found success when they were able to adapt and go to more of an e-commerce model. So it's not just alternative locations in case you have a closure because of a hurricane or a fire, but also something that just might result in stay-at-home orders. And then the last part, number 6, for those disaster planning steps, is to make sure that you practice and test that plan with the staff. If a business, many of them don't have these plans in place, but even the ones that do, sometimes it just, becomes a plan that gets put on a shelf, gathers dust. We want to make sure that, you're taking it out and you are exercising those plans and your staff is familiar with it. So everybody knows what their role is when something happens. And the last thing I like to mention is, I know we're talking about pre-disaster, but we see repetitive loss in many areas, especially the areas that are very high risk areas for different types of hazards. So SBA has a direct disaster loan program. Part of that program offers property owners, private property owners, mitigation funds at the same low interest rates that they can get to make the repairs. So SBA can provide up to 20% of the total damages that occurred as verified by SBA for that private property owner to do protective measures. So just as an example, if a business had $1 million in disaster damages, they could get up to $200,000 to do protective measures or mitigation to protect themselves against the next disaster that might occur. and they can get that at a really low interest rate. Right now, the interest rates for small businesses is at around 2.88%, I believe. And it's even lower for homeowners. Homeowners have interest rates under 2%. So it's a really great direct federal loan program that helps them do mitigation and protective measures, makes it affordable for them. And this is also important for, different stakeholders in the private sector to know about this program. I've met many companies out there who are doing this really great work about promoting the benefits of doing mitigation. And this is a vehicle that they can use in order to make it more affordable, because that's one of the first obstacles that you run into when you're talking to property owners about doing mitigation is the cost. They're worried about how they're going to pay for it, what are the costs. But your home or your business is probably your best investment that you have. It's so important that you protect it, not just for your financial investments, but you might be protecting your family or your employees. So many great things at SBA. I'd encourage people to go to sba.gov/prepare and look at the content that we have there.
Thanks, Alejandro. That was, I think, a really important place to segue. And Luke, I'd like to, to kind of push that to you. It seems like a repetitive loss program might be something the insurance sector would be interested in. And how have you worked perhaps with SBA to promote that so the assets that you're investing in the risk is reduced?
Yeah, so well, I think, I don't have any direct requests out here for any government agencies. I mean, the best that we can do is become an early participant. And I think we've been able to do that over and over again. We've been in low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credit, opportunity zone investments at the federal level as one of the first institutions. And then I could rifle off a bunch else at the state level. But, reducing risks, I think, starts with, understanding the needs of the community and the business environment. And when I think of resiliency and the idea of being able to absorb, avoid, and recover, I try to give examples of how we've done that, like, absorbing potential climate threats by working closely with recently passed legislation down in Washington, D.C. to reduce stormwater runoff by being part of the green infrastructure that's being built down there, or avoiding harmful events by being that startup capital for firms like Aero Farms, Bright Farms, and Equilibrium, who are designing controlled environment agriculture in our country. And then finally, recovering. I mean, the SBA has done a lot around, giving the small businesses the capital, the working capital that they need. And we've been part of the investor community with community development finance institutions, and just making sure that those PPP programs are being administered, and then also, offering voluntary programs, seeing at the local level what's required to bring retail businesses back as companies like Prudential start to arrive again in central business districts.
Oh, that's perfect. And so, Camille, how can the BRIC program? Luke talked a lot about the investments that they're making. Alejandro mentioned, the way in which they're looking at reducing repetitive loss. How do you see the BRIC program collaborating with both Luke and the private sector, the investments they're making and leveraging those, as well as your fellow USG colleagues?
I think there's a couple of different approaches. One is we talk about this whole community is when the community starts thinking through what their needs are for building resilience, they're looking across all sectors, right? They're looking at their different facilities. They're looking at their neighborhoods. They're looking at future conditions. That's something we care a lot about in the BRIC program, including climate change. But, and then BRIC becomes one of those tools that can be used. As I said, one grant program is not going to solve all the resiliency needs in a community. So it really, I think it's on us to give a lot of technical assistance, provide a lot of guidance to communities who are going to be looking across their needs and then figuring out how to best get it all done. Because these are, whether it's the transportation facilities, the communication, housing, energy resiliency, water needs, it's a multi-faceted need out there that they need to achieve. And so I think BRIC can be a catalyst, can be one element that can help them in achieving their mitigation goals. With CDBG, for example, with HUD, that can be included as match. It loses when it gets to the state, it loses its federal identity, so it can be used. It can, it's kind of a portfolio management approach, but you could partner the BRIC funds with CDBG funds in getting whole projects done. And one thing I will give a plug to is, as we're rolling out year 2 of BRIC and the $1 billion we're going to make available, we're planning for the month of August. We're actually starting tomorrow with our webinar series. And our first one's going to be on climate change, future conditions, and nature-based solutions, and how those play a role in building community resiliency. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Kevin, given the kind of the broad implications and reach of CDBG and the Section 108 program that you have, these are tools that HUD has that can work with both SBA and FEMA, as well as with the private sector. Kind of what barriers do you see are out there to HUD doing more of what it would like to do? And, how can the private sector help with that?
Well, there are 26 eligible uses of CDBG, as you pointed out. So it's an incredibly flexible program. You can use it to buy land, build infrastructure. You can use it for working capital loans to small businesses. So it's very, very flexible, but united around the common goal of improving low and moderate income individuals and neighborhoods. So I think and it's certainly been used either as the grant itself or as a 108 economic development loan to drive significant economic development. So as the folks on the phone, if you're a business that's only in one location or wherever your anchor location is, encourage you to reach out to your city. It's usually something like a community development department or housing and community development department. Figure out how you can work together to revitalize the neighborhood that your business might be based in or served, or even employ residents from. I think there's no shortage of opportunities to leverage these funds and make good things happen. And particularly when you look at the community development scale, you can think of an economic revitalization strategy, right? You look at efforts, like in Detroit with anchor institutions and other cities with anchor institutions, to go into a community to say, city, what resources do you have to put on the table? Private sector, what resources do you have to put on the table? And how can we have a comprehensive revitalization strategy? And I think as you're doing that, since this is the resilience panel, as you're doing that, how do you not only revitalize the economy in that area, but bake in resilience to future storms, so that you're not coming back in 5, 6, 7 years when a disaster inevitably happens and puts you on a new slate again?
That's a great way to end our panel. I'd like to thank our experts once again, and thank the Chamber Foundation. And now we'll turn it back to you. Thanks, everyone.